Alright class, rhetorical theories. We're moving on to our next subject, which is the philosopher Socrates. Socrates is a good bridge character because once you've learned about Socrates you can move on to Plato, and in Plato we have the first comprehensive discussion from a philosophical standpoint of what rhetoric is and what rhetoric's flaws are. So let's talk a little bit about Socrates. This is a Wikipedia page which provides biographical information, a story about his philosophy, and also details about his death, which was a very interesting story in and of itself. You should note that Plato's dialogues, later we're going to talk about Plato. Plato wrote some works of literature, over 30 of them as a matter of fact, that he called dialogues, and in most cases you'll see here Socrates is the main character in the dialogues. The very early dialogues that Plato wrote were probably good representations of what Socrates believed and taught. Here are some things we know about Socrates. First of all, let's get a closer look at him. First of all, we know that Socrates was not like the sophists in that he didn't teach or profess to teach for a fee. As a matter of fact, his characteristics as a philosopher was he tended to walk around the city. He loved Athens. He loved the city life. He would meet up with his proteges who were young men. They would walk around. They would have conversations. Some of the men that followed him or studied with him or were his proteges were from wealthy families. Oftentimes that meant that he had the opportunity to have dinner or even drink with them, and actually some of the dialogues actually sound a little bit like drinking parties where they're just going into the night discussing things and having a lot of wine. The most famous example of that is a famous dialogue by Plato in which Socrates is featured, called the Symposium, in which they talk about things like love and art and beauty. Socrates was a contemporary of Gorgias, who we've already talked about, Gorgias being one of the more famous sophists. And one of the great things about Gorgias is that when Plato later decided to write a dialogue about rhetoric, he called it Gorgias and made Gorgias and Socrates two of the primary arguers or characters in the dialogue. Socrates had an interesting life. First of all, even though he was a philosopher, he wasn't a philosopher in the sense of we think of it today. Today we think of a philosopher basically as an academic or a scholar who writes and researches in the area of philosophy. Socrates never wrote anything. As a matter of fact, one of his philosophical teachings was that you learn philosophy or you master philosophy through the art of discussion, that you have dialogues which are called dialectic, back and forth, kind of logical discussions and questions which lead to an improvement and refinement of knowledge. He felt that writing down things as a tract or a treatise or in a lengthy permanent form in fact diminished the ability to analyze or understand a topic, so he discouraged that, and he in fact never taught philosophy anything in other than an oral form. We also know that because he was a teacher and because he was a contemporary of some of the early sophists, that he was sometimes himself accused of being a sophist. As a matter of fact, there was a famous ancient Greek playwright by the name of Aristophanes, and he wrote comedies, and in one of his famous comedies, which I believe is called The Clouds, Socrates appears as a kind of a foolish character to be made fun of, and is even called a sophist. Clearly, there's a differentiation between the type of teaching, philosophizing, and investigation of knowledge that Socrates involved with and what the sophists were involved with. Socrates was very much about what we today call introspection. He coined the famous phrase, "the unexamined life is not worth living," and he always wanted to find out what the truth was, and he was always convinced that He really knew nothing, and the whole quest of one's life was to try to know something. On the other hand, the Sophists pretty much believed that what they had mastered or what they knew as their trade or their practical ability that they would teach to others was surely knowable and demonstrable, and therefore they would charge people a fee or a tuition in order to learn that. So there was a definite contrast between the kind of practical knowledge that the Sophists taught and the very philosophical knowledge that Socrates was attempting to obtain. One thing I will say about Socrates before I end this short audio video cast is that Socrates died a very unusual death. It turns out that there was a lot of bad blood in Athens during the time that Socrates lived and taught in Athens. Athens went through some of its most horrible wars and crises. There were wars that they lost with Sparta and with Persia. There were incredible famines and disease as a result of the wars and the strategies that were adopted during the wars. And there was just a lot of mistrust of people who the wealthy class in Athens felt were responsible for the decline of Athens' power and influence and prestige. And somebody like Socrates became kind of a scapegoat for that. He fell into disfavor. So we don't know exactly what the circumstances are. You can actually research this and read about this yourself if you're interested. But he was accused with certain really horrible crimes, including impiety, which means not respecting the gods of Athens, and corrupting the youth. In other words, the people that were following him, these young men, that he was corrupting them in terms of the teaching and the philosophy that he was passing along against them. And as a result, he had a trial. The speech that he gave as a trial is one of Plato's dialogues. It's called the Apology. If you're not familiar with it, or if you have time, I really recommend that you take a look at it and read it. It's available online in the public domain sources, numerous places. Again, it's called the Apology. It's not an apology in the sense of apologizing. It's an apology in the sense of the ancient meaning of the word apology, which is, or apologia, which is a speech or a statement in one's defense. So if you're accused of a crime, the speech that you would give defending yourself is called an apology or apologia. So this is a famous speech in which he tells the story of how he became a philosopher. And one of the things he talks about is going to the oracle of Delphi and asking the oracle who's the wisest man in the world. And I think the oracle told him that, in fact, he was the wisest man in the world. And that was because he was the only man that acknowledged that he knew nothing. That he would have met all kinds of men who thought they were wise but knew nothing. But he knew nothing and acknowledged he knew nothing. Therefore, according to the oracle, he was wiser than all the men who claimed to have wisdom. That's what's called the Socratic paradox, that the wisest person is the one who knows that he's not wise or knows nothing. Anyway, Socrates had his trial. He gave a speech. It's a beautiful speech. It's an example of rhetoric, so it's worth looking at just for that purpose alone. But in the speech, he does some very odd things. For example, he feels that if he's guilty, that his punishment ought to be that they allow him to live and give him free dinners for life, because he provides a very powerful and important role in the Athenian society of always questioning people and making it uncomfortable for them. But in fact, he was found guilty, and they didn't sentence him to free dinners for life. They sentenced him to death. He even had the opportunity to leave Athens. Some of the rich young men who followed him were going to pay off his jailer and let him escape and be in exile. And that could have easily been accomplished. But Socrates decided that since he had lived his whole life in Athens, that he was going to respect the laws of Athens, and since by the laws of Athens he had been tried and convicted, he would face his penalty, which was death by hemlock, meaning he would drink a poison in his cell and die. So there's another couple dialogues, one about the attempt to convince him to leave the city, and yet another one in which he actually drinks the poison and dies, and all those can be read. But the apology is certainly one that's worth looking at. Even if you just read a synopsis of it, it would be worthwhile. This article in Wikipedia has a synopsis of what happens in the apology of Socrates. Now, Socrates is a bridge character for us because he leads us to Plato. Plato was one of the young men that followed him, and Plato, who actually came from a wealthy family in Athens, decided that what happened to Socrates was unforgivable, and so he himself decided to devote his life to philosophy, and he would become a philosopher. And he would also open a school. And in the school he would teach things which were contrary to what the sophists taught. And across the street from him would be another school, that of Socrates, a different person, different from Socrates, which taught rhetoric, and so there's a natural contrast. So the next thing that we're going to discuss in the next video is the relationship between Plato and rhetoric. Plato, as I said, wrote dialogues. Socrates was featured in the dialogues. Two of his most famous dialogues, in fact, Gorgias and Phaedrus, both are primarily devoted to discussions of the art of rhetoric and give examples of it. They're very different dialogues that emphasize very different things, but they're both worth looking at. So the next video that I'm going to post, I'm going to do it later today, will be about the Gorgias, which is a really, really interesting dialogue about rhetoric by Plato. When you write your first paper, which I'll give you more information about this week, the first paper will be about Plato on rhetoric, so paying attention to what I say about Gorgias and later Phaedrus is worthwhile. There are copies of both Gorgias and Phaedrus on the website, redinfo.com, so if you want to open the PDFs and read them, you're more than welcome to. But I'm going to walk you through what's said and what's discussed in those, so it's up to you whether you want to read them. All right, this is Dr. Weiss signing out.